Well, I'd like to welcome everybody for coming out this morning for our program. Just kind of a little introduction. We'll play a video here in just a minute to kind of get everything started. So I'll give kind of a brief introduction for that. We did filmed a short film out at Sand Creek at the location where we think a soldier was actually killed at Sand Creek. We filmed on location a little short film, and the characters in this are real characters from Sand Creek, and they're very important to the Sand Creek story. This is a short film and private.
I was a neighbor to Robert and Luana McFarland on September 19th, 1861. Luana gave birth to a baby girl. Robert named her Adela. I lived in the same community and watched her grow up to womanhood. I first knew their little boy in 1860. They called him George. He was about 2 years old. He lived with his parents until his mother's death. He and his sister Adela were then taken to friends in the same community. Luana died in 1864 of January, before Robert joined our company. I knew George until he was taken back east in 1864. He was about 6 years old. And I was a member of D Company of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry, the same as Robert, and I had charge of the dead and wounded of our company. I first knew him. I first knew him at his farm near Valmont, Boulder County, Colorado, in the 1860s, and I was well acquainted with him and his children. Robert McFarland was killed in the celebrated Battle of Sand Creek in November of 1864 in southern Colorado while fighting for his country. And I was with him when he was killed by the Indians. His heart was cut out and stuffed in his mouth. I buried him and brought back a lock of his hair, his trinkets, and personal effects to Boulder County, to George and Adela.
So that short film about James Carr, we show the older James Carr, is portrayed by, starting with the older James Carr, portrayed by Butch Kelly, who's actually here with us today. And then it shows him sitting down, writing a letter, and thinking back on finding his friend Robert McFarland's body at Sand Creek, and then picking up his personal effects to ship back to his children. And so kind of shows that there. He's very important in our Sand Creek story, and it's likely, and Dad has found the place at Sand Creek that's filmed where we believe he was killed, due to the artifacts that were found there that show a battle between an Indian and a soldier. It's very likely where he was killed. So he's very important. You can read more about him in our book too, and you can see maps. There's maps in our book that show where those artifacts were found that kind of proves that location. So you can definitely check that out in our book. And so with our program today, we're looking at, with the name of our book, we found the lost Sand Creek site. So for something to be found, first it had to become lost. So that's an important element to the story, is how did Sand Creek become lost? And so it's important to know, Sand Creek, November 29, 1864, and in the immediate future, the first several years after the event, the location was undoubtedly known. There was no doubt to the location. 4 years after Sand Creek, Lieutenant Bonsall went to the spot, and he measured the distance of the village. So there would, at that time, just 4 years after, there would be signs of like burned teepee remains, for example. So he could see and make out pretty much the length of the village. So he measured the village. There's a few things I'm going to point out here for you. And you can see on his map, he documents a place called Three Forks. And that's a very important landmark to documenting and knowing the location of the village, and even where they would have fought, where a lot of the fighting would have taken place. Because Three Forks is that point where you can measure from. And so he measures down 6 miles to his camp number 2. And in between there, he measures about 2.5 miles for the length of the village right in here. And so we're going to come back to this later, but this is important to note, the location of Three Forks. And so the 6 miles, because if you know Three Forks, you can measure down 6 miles to his camp number 2, and then he started up from there, and then 2.5 miles for the village. So that's very important to note, to come back to. We'll show that, so that just 4 years after, it was undoubtedly known where the location was. So he measured the distance, and we're going to come back to Three Forks in a little bit. And so you can see, we're going to show a map later, and there's more in our book. We actually found where Three Forks is, and it's actually located in Cheyenne County, where Three Forks is located, and several miles up the creek from where the monument stood at the National Park Service site. So it's several miles from there. But soon after, this would have been 1868, so soon after that, the location would become, at the time, hopelessly lost. And so some things happened. In 1894, the USGS topo map was available, and this then, noted specific locations, bends in the creek, things like that, became more important landmarks. But it's important to note about this 1894 USGS topo map, it did not mark the place where Shivington brought his soldiers, or it did not mark the Black Kettles village. It is not on that map. And so, as far as maps go, by 1894, it is not documented. There's no documentation at that point outside of this Bonsall map that shows, you can go down 6 miles from Three Forks, but other than that, and that Bonsall map is a strip map, so it's not, you just have to know, if you know where Three Forks is, then you can measure down. But it's important to note. So 1894, we get that USGS topo map, and then in 1908, 4 veteran soldiers attempted to hold a reunion, and they got together, and they decided they were going to go try to mark the spot where they fought. Well, interestingly, it's interesting that when they went to mark the spot, there's 4 of them, and we go into a lot more greater detail in our book, but the 4 of them, they went down Sand Creek, they went to lots of different places, and all 4 had a different spot. None of the 4 could agree on the location. And so by 1908, it's definitely lost. If you don't have, and Bonsall's map, and for whatever reason, it kind of goes, nobody really knows what happens to it for a long time. So available, not that long ago. So they went down to measure, and they could not agree on a spot. What we don't know, though, is how far down Sand Creek they went. And we'll get a little more into him a little bit later, but there's a soldier that was at Sand Creek named Irving Halbert. And he actually ended up providing one of the biggest clues for finding artifacts. But it's my belief, and I kind of would think that he would have remembered what the ground would have looked like, because his how he described the land and what they rode over that day and where they fought was so precise, and his descriptions were so incredible. I think if he had been with those four guys, if they had gone down far enough down Sand Creek, they would have known, and they would have agreed on a location. Um, but there's one major point that we can look at for why the site was, mismarked and placed at a specific bend. One reason was something that Colonel Shivington said. He said the village was, quote, on the south branch of the Big Sandy, or Big Bend of the Sandy. So most believed that it was on the bend furthest to the south. And so when they look at the bend furthest to the south, they look at that bend that's over there by the National Park Service site. And so that's one of the reasons it was settled on there. But there's a big moment in our book, and so I encourage you to, if you haven't read our book, pick up our book, because there's a big moment in the book where it's realized that when Shivington said this, he was meaning something so much differently than a specific bend. And it is an amazing moment in the book. But we learned he was referring to something very different. And another reason that they chose that bend by the National Park Service site is that bend looks almost identical to the bend on what people call the George Bent map. And so there's a few things I need to point out on this map, and it's really hard to see. And then you can see too, it's really hard to see, but there's fold lines on this map. One thing, there's fold lines, and there's two different sets of handwriting on this map. So right away, there's a couple issues with this map. So everyone calling this the George Bent map, not realizing George Bent didn't actually make this map. So what had happened, and it's our belief from reading directly from George Bent's letters, because later in his life, when he was an Indian agent in Oklahoma, he wrote letters to historians. One of those historians was a man named George Hyde. And in a letter to George Hyde, in multiple letters to George Hyde, he would say, I have made map, or I have finished the map that you sent me. He said this many times. And so Hyde would mail George Bent a map, and then he would finish the map that Hyde had sent him. He would fill in the details. And so it's important to know when George Bent filled in those details, he would fill in those details with the information he got as an Indian agent. So he would go and talk to older Indians that would come in and he was helping with. He would ask them while he was an Indian agent. He would get information from them and then just fill in the details on the map as they told him. So it's important to note that what's known as the George Bent map. It's you can see if you look at it closely. There's two different sets of handwriting on his maps. And then there's another map in color, and there's blue and there's black ink on the maps. I mean, you can see there's different color on the map, different sets of handwriting, and so it's our belief based on the letters he sent to George Hyde that George Hyde would send him maps. He would fill in the details, and then we believe that George Hyde copied the bend from that USGS 1894. I want to say the wrong date on that USGS topo map. 1894 on the topo map. And this is then, years go by, and Hyde makes this map. He copies it from this topo map. He sends it to Bent. Bent asks the older Indians when he's helping as an Indian agent to help him fill in the details. He mails it back. There's fold lines on the map, two different sets of handwriting. It's not George Bent's map. It's George Hyde's map. And then George Bent filling in details with what he got from older Indians many, many years later. And so it's hard to know He's got teepees named and stuff, and so it'd be hard to know for with all accuracy the order and everything and how accurate everything is. But there's a reason why you look at the bend on this map and it looks almost identical to that bend over by the National Park Service site, and there's a reason for that. You're not going to free draw this map with pencil like nearly 40 years or over 40 years after Sand Creek and it look identical to that bend over by the NPS site. This was clearly traced from that topo map. I think that is an idea that we are correct on, because George Bent even said, "I have finished the maps you have sent me." So it's not even his map. And so there's one issue there, is the issue with the bend. There's another issue, and there's issues with why that wouldn't work. Is we're told historically through that traditional Sand Creek Massacre story, that narrative is that the Indians were camped right below a bluff. And we're going to get to this in a moment. There's problems with this bluff. And so I'm going to show you this right here. This is actually a picture taken, I believe, in 1970. And so this shows this bluff, and we're told that they're basically camped just right below this bluff. There's lots of issues here. Chinook winds, for example. What would happen with Chinook winds? And this is from our book. A northerly wind, accompanied by lots of snow, could have buried the entire village. Chinook winds coming over this bluff would go over the village in the hollow below. The bluff would also block the warmth of the sun, low in the southern sky. Snow would take a long time to melt. Even the cows gather on the south side of a windbreak before a winter storm. The idea Indians camped on the north side of this bluff defies common sense. The village artifacts and fire pits I found show the teepees were on the north side of the creek on a bank about 4 feet high. This bank and the area below absorbed the warmth of the sun, making it a good place for their daily tasks. At this location, Chinook winds would go into the village instead of over it. This would be the sensible place for a winter camp. And so we see here, there's lots of problems camped right below this bluff. It just would not, snow would take a long time to melt, wind, it would just not be a sensible place to camp. We even just demonstrate based on what cattle do during a winter storm. And so that is another issue with that story. So we're running into a lot of issues doing research. They were doing research before their discovery, finding, there's some issues here. It's some things just don't seem to add up here. And another thing that's told about that traditional story is that we're told that the Indians were basically slaughtered as they came out of their teepees, and they had no advance warning. They didn't see any soldiers coming, and as they were awakened in their teepees, getting out of their beds, they were slaughtered. Here's the thing. That's what we're told historically. First off, that story is not supported by artifacts. It's not meant to be offensive, but I'm about truth. And that's really what we're about, is about just getting the truth out there based on about where artifacts were found. No period artifacts have ever been found below this bluff. They've all been found well up the creek from that bluff. And so we know that, and here's another reason why we don't believe their soldiers were camped below that bluff. Here's the thing. We know the village was further up the creek from two different eyewitness sources. One was Irving Halbert, and one was George Bent. George Bent was not a soldier. George Bent was in the Cheyenne camp with Black Kettle, and he was a Cheyenne warrior, also known as a dog soldier. George Bent writes about wagon train raids and killing white settlers and taking captives the summer of 1864 before Sand Creek. And he's very upfront about all of this. This is directly from his letters. And it's important to note, all the information we got from George Bent was straight from his letters. There's a book that's called The Life of George Bent that came out maybe I think around the 60s or something like that. But it is not written by him. It's not even a paraphrase. There's a lot of liberties taken and information in the book that does not even come from his letters. So everything we have from George Bent is straight from his letters. So according to George Bent, they had an advanced warning. And that's important. We'll get to that here in a minute. But again, no period artifacts been found below this bluff. There was a man named Fred Warner. And he was not maybe a known name that you would recognize, but he went out to Sand Creek. At the time, this was owned by Bill Dawson, and he went out and he made several trips over several summers and was accompanied on several trips by a man named Larry Fennell. Larry Fennell was very experienced, and so was Fred Warner, with using a metal detector. Larry Fennell found hundreds of artifacts at the Summit Springs site near Sterling. Hundreds of artifacts. Very experienced. These were not a couple just amateur, didn't know what they were doing with a metal detector. These guys knew what they were doing. Multiple trips, and out of all those trips, they never found one single period artifact. And they searched and searched below this bluff, searched and searched. Here's an excerpt from Fred Warner's book. I found absolutely nothing except a few junk items, tin cans and wire. Neither of us had found a single battle relic. And that's from Fred Warner's book on page 167. And it's incredible. We have all of these citations and sources also in our book for everything, any books that we cited from that people talking about Sand Creek like Fred Warner. And this quote, he says, I found absolutely nothing. That's repeated multiple times in that book. And what is intriguing and interesting to me is after he'd finished his book, in his conclusion, he still thought the artifacts were there to be found. They just weren't doing something right or looking in the right spot. They're definitely not in the right spot, but they were almost 2 miles away from being in the right spot. And so that's important to know there. So that below the bluff kind of shows you some issues there with that story. And so another thing, we come back to that comment made by Colonel Shiviton. We need to think more broadly about that idea, the South Branch or Big Bend. We need to think more broadly when it comes to that term. And so, and there you can see our book there. And what we learn is not a specific bend. And we get more specific about this in our book. And here's some information. As the soldiers, they're leaving north of Denver by Longmont. And on their trip, they're picking up more soldiers as they head south. And they hit snow. They hit a lot of snow. It's before old Colorado City. And many on this trip, many of the soldiers actually got frostbite. So we don't ever hear about this story. It's a long, long ride to get from where they went to by Longmont all the way down to Fort Lyon, New Bent's Fort area. They had a long, long ride once they got there. But all along the way, what they would do is that Shimington, he would leave soldiers behind to guard the trail, like at a fort, or he would guard the trail so nobody would go give an advanced warning to the Indians. So he would leave soldiers along the trail. This happened at a few places. One was at Boone. There was a ranch there named after for what was A.G. Boone's ranch. You might know the Boone name. He was Daniel Boone's grandson. And in our book, we go into really specific information about A.G. Boone and his relationship with George Bent. So you can learn a lot more about A.G. Boone and Bent in our book. You can also learn more about that on our website, on our blogs. We've got several blogs we talk about Bent as well. But Shimington is going along. He's going down, leaving soldiers around the trail to guard forts and such so they could keep the word from spreading that they were on their way to Sand Creek. And so one of those was at Boone. Another one, they get down and they leave guard around the Bent Ranch. They pick up Robert Bent. He's very important in this story. Get to that in just a moment. And so they get him. They make their final trek to Fort Lyon, the New Bent's Fort. And then that following morning, we're talking about November 28th. And so they leave about mid-November. What's interesting is this is almost lines up the time they left to head towards Fort Lyon, New Bent's Fort, is about the same time the Indians went to Sand Creek, because they got there about the middle of November. And so that's kind of interesting. It's all happening right about the same time. And so what we need to think about is when we hear surprise attack, we think about that the surprise was the Indians surprising the soldiers surprising the Indians as they slept. But there's a different type of surprise attack because Shimington did not want them to have an advance notice. And so that's important to note. And so here's an important note. So Indians would be dragging their teepees, and so this would have left ruts in the ground as they're dragging their teepees over up to Sand Creek. And so as they make their trek to Sand Creek, there would be like teepee ruts in the ground. You'd think that would be easy to follow, for the soldiers to follow. But when they left on the 28th that night, it was pitch dark. The only light they had was the light from the stars. There was no moonlight that night. And so really that would probably be very hard to navigate that, even with those ruts in the ground from dragging their teepees. So it makes sense. There's a reason why they had Robert Bent. They picked up Robert Bent, and he was made to then be their guide to take them to Sand Creek. He was not a willing participant. It's important to note Robert Bent was not a willing participant to lead the soldiers there. He had two brothers there, George and Charlie, were there in camp there at Sand Creek. So he definitely did not have reason to want to help. And so that's important too. And so I'm going to go ahead and pull this up and just kind of leave this on the screen for a minute. But so Robert Bent, nobody ever talks about Robert Bent with the Sand Creek story, because he actually does something that's quite remarkable. Because we think that the soldiers just came up on the Indians, they were sleeping, but even on that itself is hard for me to think the how, because you're talking about 700 soldiers on horseback, cannons in the lead. These cannons, this would be loud. There's nothing quiet about this. This would be very loud. And so it's important to note that they would have heard them coming, but we know from eyewitness sources we'll get into in just a little bit, they saw them coming. So it's important to note. But here, so Robert Bent does something very remarkable. So on his way, because again, he has no reason to help. So he's leading the soldiers, and he's taking them along. And so you think about that road, what we'd think about would be like Road 49, what we call the May Valley Road, and then 96. But, they're heading towards Sand Creek. And so they're going along, and they're going through, and one of the things he does is he takes them through a lake. And so we know by him taking them through a lake, it's not, they kind of start to go through the lake and come back. But here's the thing. It wasn't frozen, but we know it was cold and it was wet. His idea and his plan was to wet the ammunition, to get the ammunition wet so it would be less effective when they got to Sand Creek. And so he tried to thwart the attack. Again, he's got two brothers there. If you had siblings camp something, you're going, they're going to go attack Black Kettle's village. They're going to try to protect them. So he didn't want to help very much, but he tries to thwart the attack. And then, they keep on traveling. And so then we get to, they continued, and Robert Bent, he explains to Shimonton, he was able to convince Shimonton they need to turn off that lodgepole trail. So they're following this lodgepole trail, and in the village, this lodgepole trail is right about in here. It kind of curves down. I have a hard time making that straight, but you can kind of imagine there's a lodgepole trail that comes down through here. So he convinces them to turn off the lodgepole trail and head east. So here's what's important. Why is this important? If they had continued up this lodgepole trail, we mark this on our map as the village because of all of the hundreds of village artifacts that were found. We're talking about kettle fragments. We're talking about spoons and knives and arrowheads and things that would be typical of an Indian village. It's been found all in here, showing several, not just several, but a lot of teepee sites in here. So we know that the village is right in here just based on artifact discovery. So if they had taken them straight and continued on that lodgepole trail, it would have gone right into the center of the village. And on this trail, it would have been hard to be seen, especially when they got there that morning. It was basically kind of like a blue light, like that blue hum of light. It's just, the sun hasn't quite come up yet. It's basically still dark. There had been no way to see them. So yeah, they would have come right into the center of the village, and they probably would have been successful in taking out most of the village. Because we know that this is a discussion we've gotten into before, but the number of Indians killed at Sand Creek has varied over the years. The official count was 69. Other counts at that same time ranged in the 80s, around 100. And today the National Park Service has about 260 some, and we're not sure where that number comes from because there's no additional information that's been given. It's just we're given a new number. But we know there has not been a new count. So, but if they'd gone in the center village, it would have just been, it would have been like, total probably wipeout of the village. But Robert Bent, he does something quite remarkable. So he convinces Shivington to turn off that lodgepole trail. So they're coming up this lodgepole trail, and it's kind of probably down, below this map a little bit where we have this map. But he convinces them to come down this lodgepole trail. And up on this trail, it's a higher elevation here. You can actually be seen when you're down here. You can see it's like you can see the cars go by on road W. And so you're down a little further. It's even a little bit higher. And so what happened was, Robert Bent convinces Shivington to take them off that trail. Well, he did this intentionally because he knew that that would give the Indians an opportunity to see the approaching soldiers and get out. And so what happens is, we're going to get into this in just a moment, why that's really important. So they head off that trail, and we'll see, they head and continue down that way. And this is before the sun came up. And so they reach where the monument used to stand. And we're not really sure why that monument was removed, but the monument was removed. And, you can kind of see that in here. And they head that way around that ridge or that bluff. And so they have to go down too, is when they reach that ridge, they can't go. I'm going to go back to that photo for a minute. Because they reach the top of this ridge, you can't just ride right down that ridge. You wouldn't do that on a horse. You're not going to ride right. So you have to go around, go back down. There's kind of a little slope down there, and go around. And then at this point, somewhere out away from this bluff a ways, they would have dropped off whatever they would not have needed for battle. So they would have dropped that off and then head up the creek. But in the meantime, they were spotted. We're going to come back to that. We're going to come back to that in just a moment. And another thing with that story is that that everyone, we talk about, it was, they say it's a massacre because it was indiscriminate slaughter of women and children. Here's something that George Bent said that's very interesting. And this is from a letter he wrote to George Hyde, dated May 24th, 1906. Soldiers could not tell the difference and would have killed the women, taken them for men. It's important to understand that the Indian women and the men, they all looked a lot alike. And, a lot of times the women did the hard work of the camp. They would tan the hides, skin the hides. They would put up the teepees and the lodge. They would put all that stuff, take it down. They did a lot of the hard work. And there's actually, George Bent even talks about in letters how Indian women slaughtered other Indian children. And so George Bent talks about this. There were some Shoshone boys that were killed by Indian women and cut up. They were definitely not weak. They were far from weak, and even George Bent said they would not be able to tell the difference. And so that's important. All of this is important information. And so and this is not a question to answer, just something to think about. You think, well, what is the worst massacre in U.S. history? And it's just something to think about. You think about the worst massacre in United States history. Now, if you don't count 9/11, if you don't include that, then the worst one would be what's called the Minnesota Massacre. And what happened in Minnesota was in 1862, where over 600 were killed by Indians. That's far more that was even camped at Sand Creek. And so over 600 were killed. And what happened was that at the time, President Lincoln had 30 of them hung for what they did. And so the people, though, were outraged because they didn't want the 30 hanged. They wanted all 300 hanged. They wanted all of them to be hanged. They want all hung and to suffer for what they did. But only 30 of them are hung. And so we know about Minnesota Massacre 1862. So by 1864, settlers that are coming into Colorado Territory, they're coming in, and in the Denver area especially. And so it's important to note there was rumors of a repeated attack in Colorado Territory. It would have been the summer, it had been August of 1864. So August, September, October, November, just a little over 3 months before Sand Creek, there was a man that went by the name of Elbridge Gerry. And Elbridge Gerry got word of this and decided he was going to make warning. And see, he made about a 70-mile trip to Denver and started warning people and letting people know that there's a potential repeated attack from the Minnesota Massacre right here in Colorado territory. So what people did then was prepare themselves and armed themselves and were ready. They were ready to go to make sure that event didn't happen again. And he was successful, because we know in history that didn't happen. But there was a rumor that that was about to be a repeat. Another thing, there's some things that kind of led to Sand Creek. Another thing was in June of 1864, east of Denver, there was the Hungate family. Nathan Hungate, his wife, and two little girls. We're talking about 18-month-old. We're talking babies that were slaughtered by Indians, cut all the way down and killed by Indians. And so their bodies were taken to Denver and put on display. And so this enraged people. So they would see these bodies on display, so it provoked anger, and so they were ready to fight back if needed. And so in June, that happened in June, and then August, Elbridge Gerry, and so that's important to note. And then George Bent talks about that spring of 1864. He talks about those wagon train raids and taking white captives, killing white settlers. And this is the spring before Sand Creek, and so he talks about this openly in his letters. And so that's just an important thing to know for context, for things that happened going up and going into Sand Creek, for why the soldiers went there. There's also some confusions about events at Sand Creek. One of those was what's called the rifle pits. And so at the rifle pits, that we hear that there are a lot of places along the creek where Indians would kind of hunker down and kind of hide. And a lot of people think those were rifle pits, but those were just places where they just hunkered down and got into the sand and hid. But here's what's important, is there are actual rifle pits. George Bent talks about two of them, and he talks about one. He said that one pit, the pit he got into, 19 people could get into. That's a big hole for 19 people. That's like this whole room. That's like all of us getting into one pit. And so it's important to note. So he talks about these rifle pits. So there's this debate where the rifle pits dug that morning, as the story tells us. The traditional story says that the Indians ran and they dug rifle pits that morning. Well, the rifle pits, George Bent says they ran 2.5 miles from the top of the village, and then he got into a pit. I think it'd be really hard, even with an advanced warning, to go run 2.5 miles and dig a pit for 19 people to fit in. So there's just a lot of things that just don't add up. And so where did they get this idea? So if they did dig these before Sand Creek, how would the Indians know about this tactic? So it's important to note, again, George Bent is in the camp. George Bent fought in the Civil War. In 4 Civil War battles, he would have been familiar with this foxhole or rifle pit idea. He would have been very familiar with it, and he could have helped them dig this pit, because all the times the Indians would talk about how, they couldn't fight in the winter, they could only fight in the spring. And so it's our belief that the Indians were preparing a place further up the creek where they could draw the soldiers into battle and fight them in the spring and shoot at them from rifle pits. Again, this is from George Bent. And so that's important. He says 19 people could get in there, and he could have easily helped them dig these pits. And so there's other things. We talk about, let's see if this is, okay, you come and you see that this kind of marks where that lodgepole would have gone through. And this map is also in our book with a lot more information on it. But we see here that lodgepole trail would have gone through there. And then there's a reason why this lodgepole trail is marked on our map, is that, the lodgepole trail, there are signs of that lodgepole trail that were found on Sand Creek on the Bowen family ranch that Dad found. And so you see the lodgepole trail, it goes through here. It was signs of this were found on the ranch of the lodgepole trail, and it lines up with going right through that village. And so that's important to note. There's signs of the lodgepole trail. When it's important also, about 2005, I think, a man named Ed Bars was here. He was nationally known. He was historian emeritus with the National Park Service. He was on the History Channel all the time with Civil War documentaries, and he was very well known, very well respected, and known historian. He was there and saw this lodgepole trail, and saw this village area and where many artifacts were found. Another thing too is that there were artifacts that were found, and in May, I believe May of 1999, the lead archaeologist with the National Park Service, Dr. Doug Scott, went to my mom and dad's home to identify artifacts. And one of the artifacts he identified was a cannonball shell fragment. He identified tons of even 1860s nails. We're talking about bullets, kettle fragments, lots and lots of artifacts he identified in their home on VHS. It was documented on VHS camcorder, and in their home, he identified them, gave them kudos for what they found, and then turned around and wrote a book years later and threw them under the bus and said that they found New Chicago. New Chicago was a proposed town site. Some of you may have heard of New Chicago before. If you've heard of it, you probably haven't, because there's a reason for that. It never took place. It never happened. It was an idea on paper, and that is it. And so New Chicago, we know that it was interesting because they put out their resource guide, and they put maps out there, and they said where they put an X, this was New Chicago. What he found was New Chicago. But it's interesting because the place where they put an X was littered with cannonball shell fragments, not a proposed town site. There's nothing there to even hint at a town site. So what happened was there were these proposed town sites, and they were, each of them were hoping to be picked as like the water stopper, be picked, for the train to go through. And so it's interesting, because Water Valley, we know about Water Valley, and with Water Valley, it documents where Water Valley was, and it says that where Water Valley, and it gives the coordinates in our book, and then it says from there, just a couple miles straight north of Water Valley. And so interestingly, they were off by 3 miles where they say this New Chicago was supposed to have taken place, but it didn't. That X was marking the what they were saying was New Chicago was actually littered with cannonball shell fragments. And so kind of going through this, so my mom and dad, they kind of decide to search for Sand Creek, and they decide to study eyewitness accounts, because that's what you decided they can trust, is those that were there. And so they studied eyewitness accounts, looked for land descriptions, things like that, and ended up finding over 4,000 Sand Creek period artifacts. And that is all in detail in the book. It's important also to note that Dad had a unique advantage. So he would read an eyewitness account. It's important to note when they're giving a land description, he grew up there. He knew that land like the back of his hand. Nobody else had spent that kind of time ever on that part of Sand Creek. So he knew precisely the areas they were talking about. And so they would get clues. He would go search with a metal detector. And after finding lots of artifacts, he found village artifacts. And you can see these arrows, they're pointing out where there would be running battle locations. So this lines up with George Bent. He said, they had an advance warning. There's an Indian there named Little Bear. And early that morning, a morning of Sand Creek, he got up very early in the morning, and he decided to go get his pony, and he looked south toward that lodgepole trail. And there's a better map I'll show you in a minute, but he looked south toward that lodgepole trail, and they saw soldiers, and he said they looked like a long black line. So to see soldiers as a long black line, that's going to be quite a ways away. So that's important to note. So they saw them as a long black line, so they had an advance warning to get away. So you can see running battle locations. They're just going in multiple directions, and then several miles away from each other. This marks 1 mile. That's important to note. I mean, this is miles up the creek. You're talking about the monument location, and you're talking about way up the creek. They start finding artifacts, and in miles in different directions. And so what George Bent says they had a head start to flee, they did, and they found artifacts going in multiple directions. So again, this is interesting. A lot of maybe thought that we're maybe in this to make a lot of money or something like that. We're definitely not. Sand Creek, this discovery is about recognition and truth. It's all this is about. It's all about just recognition and for what was found, because what was found does change the story. It doesn't just add additional locations, it changes the story immensely.
Mike, one of the members of the Park Service who people would know in this town promised us recognition, which it never came.
So it's important to note this is all, I mean, and that is, it's all documented in our book. You can see specifically who promised recognition and, you know, what was promised. How did they follow through? Did anyone follow through? Has there been any credit for discovery? That's all in the book. And you probably maybe know the answer to that, but this is all what we're doing was we're just letting people know the truth about what was found and how that it does change the story. That's important. Is all we care about is truth. We don't have a dog in this fight. We don't have any ancestors. Nobody was related to us. It was at Sand Creek. The only connection is that Dad grew up on that part of Sand Creek. So when they learned in the 90s that the site might not be in the right location, they got interested and thought, well, maybe if it's not there where the monument was, it could be further up the creek on Bowen land. That's the only. If without that connection, there'd be none of this. There wouldn't have been any artifacts found. None of this would have happened. So we come back to the ridge. And so Irving Halbert, who's very instrumental in this story. And then in 1908, he said this: at daylight in the morning, the command was 40 miles away from the fort. Just as the sun came up, the command reached the top of a ridge overlooking the valley of the Big Sandy, from which point a large Indian village could be seen scattered along the north bank of the stream about 3 miles away. About 3 miles away. That's a long way. So I don't like just going back. But again, they reached the top of a ridge. He's saying from here, on the top of this ridge, they could see, scattered Indian village about 3 miles away. That's a long way. But they were able to see it scattered. And then I showed you those running battle locations. And we're going to come back to this this Bonsall map. This is important. Lieutenant Bonsall made this map, and he shows Three Forks. So look here. We've documented. You can see them, and they're actually visible in the 1936 aerial maps. And Dad spotted those immediately when he saw that map. You can see that Three Forks is visible on those maps, and it's been marked and documented. And you can come down 6 miles, like Bonsall said, and we have 1 mile marker points here, and you can see where his camp number 2 was, and then starting, he said 2.5 miles. Well, isn't that incredible? Because you come down 6 miles and you go back up. Well, where there's 2.5 miles, where he says the village was, is precisely where village artifacts were found. So it lines up with this map that was made in 1868. That both of those things corroborate and substantiate each other. So it's very important to note that you can measure down that 6 miles from Three Forks, and then there it is. The artifacts that were found fall right in where he says this event took place. I think that's incredible that just happened. I don't think that just happened, but that's substantiated that way. And so other problems with Sand Creek, and then how does this change the story? It's one thing we take pride in is being transparent in our book. Because the thing with Sand Creek, and after I've done a lot of research and helping Dad with this book, is that there are a lot of layers to Sand Creek. There's not just one flat story to say about Sand Creek. You can't paint it with a broad brush. There's a lot of elements to Sand Creek. We're transparent with that. Major Anthony, he testified, and he said in sworn testimony that he saw a few soldiers shoot at and kill like a toddler, like an Indian toddler. We are transparent about that in our book. We didn't find very many reports about this. We did find other reports of soldiers under testimony of those. There were a lot of people that testified in those hearings that were not at Sand Creek. That's another thing that was eye-opening to me. A lot of people testified that were not even there, and they continued asking them questions. But those that were there, they would some of them would say, "Yeah, I saw soldiers cut up Indians." And so that they were asked, "Can you name who did it?" It says, "No, we cannot name who did it." And so we're just putting all that information out there, letting people make up their own minds. But the artifacts absolutely, they tell it. Sometimes you hear about a story. There's two sides to a story. Well, in this case, there's the artifacts, and their story needs to be told because it really does back up that story from Irving Halbert, how he looked, and from that ridge, they looked off, and about 3 miles away, they saw an Indian camp, and sure enough, right in that mileage where that he says that he saw them, that's where village artifacts were found. So it really does back up his account. He was a very well respected man. In fact, Irving Halbert was one of the founders of Colorado Springs. And so very well respected person where he lived. And a lot of the soldiers actually were. I think in most cases, I think, yeah, there may have been there's some bad apples, like those that killed that Indian boy. But a lot of the people there at Sand Creek were well respected, including James Carr and Robert McFarland, who we depicted in our short film. And another issue was with Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Tappan. So he was the one that led the hearings following Sand Creek. So this is important. So Colonel Shivington, they have these hearings to talk about Sand Creek, and Lieutenant Colonel, so Sam Tappan, it's documented historically, he did not like Colonel Shivington. This is before Sand Creek. So Shivington, so you've got Lieutenant Colonel Sam Tappan. And so going, before Shivington was, at Glorietta. So he went to Glorietta. You've all probably heard of Glorietta. It was a major victory for Colonel Shivington and his troops. But he went into Glorietta as a major. So this is important because he went in with no military experience at all. He went in and was assigned major. It was actually initially offered to be like a chaplain because he was a Methodist preacher. So he was asked to be a chaplain. He said, really, I'd like a fighting leadership position. So they said, okay, we'll make you major. So he had a major victory at Glorietta, and just a few months after that was promoted to colonel. He skipped lieutenant colonel, went straight from major to colonel. So who was in line to become colonel? Lieutenant Colonel Sam Tappan. This is important. And so he says at the beginning of the hearings, because Shivington says, this shouldn't be happening. Tappan is known as my enemy. And Lieutenant Colonel Sam Tappan said this: as to my alleged prejudice and alleged personal enmity, even if true, I should not consider them at all influencing me. Okay, I'd say that's a really odd way of wording that. If any of us were in that position, or if I was in that position and someone said, yeah, he's got a personal thing against me, I would just flat out say, no, I don't. I wouldn't say even if true. I don't think any of us would say that. That's kind of sounds like he's not denying it. Shivington saying, hey, you're my enemy, and they kind of stack the deck against Shivington in these hearings. Because there's a lot of layers to Sand Creek. We got to understand, because at Sand Creek, like Little Bear, looking south towards that lodgepole trail, they saw the soldiers as a long black line, so the Indians fled, and they fled in multiple directions. So what happens when the soldiers arrive? They chase those Indians in multiple directions. They just go in multiple directions, chasing after Indians. And so it just, boom, right away. It's just, they're not lined up. They're not, formed in line. There's no, first line or anything like that. There's no front line. I mean, it's just, they're just chasing after Indians. And they're there because of the events that have already taken place. And so that's important to note. And another thing happened during the hearings is that Shivington was actually denied witnesses and said we must continue on without delay. And so he was denied witnesses at part of the hearings, and not very many people were there. It was allowed to testify on his behalf. So a lot of people that testified weren't there, and a lot of people that testified that were there were really vague in their responses. I'd say, I'm not trying to get political here, but when you're kind of stacking the deck like that, and you already have kind of a prejudice beforehand, you already know what direction you're going to go. To me, it kind of sounds like the Trump hearings. That's just kind of how it sounds to me. It kind of sounds like, you've got your mind made up before it happens. And Tappan did not like Shivington, regardless of what happened at Sand Creek. And again, there's so many layers to it because there was a battle. That same Major Anthony that testified that he saw the toddler also testified that he saw over 100 warriors fighting at Sand Creek. We're told that the warriors were off hunting. George Bent doesn't say that. And George Bent was, again, a warrior, a dog soldier, commonly called dog soldiers. And George Bent doesn't say that they were off hunting. He talks about them in the camp. Little Bear that saw the soldiers, he was a dog soldier or a warrior. There were lots of them there. And the other thing we have to talk about, because I talked about how they went off in multiple directions, Anthony wouldn't even have seen all of those that were there because they would have gone in different directions. So he saw at least 100. So there was also a fight. There was some soldiers that did things they shouldn't have done, but there's a lot of layers to Sand Creek. And so go on here. I'll come back to that in just a second. That's kind of more of a just for fun thing. Um, and so we think about this. If there was a hearing, a modern hearing or court proceeding of any kind, what would be more important? What's better, hearsay evidence or physical evidence? I would hope that any answer would be physical. You know how difficult it is to administer hearsay evidence in court? It's very hard to verify. Hearsay evidence is almost impossible to verify. So that's the thing, is all of this comes down to physical evidence. And so that's the only concrete evidence is physical evidence, and everything else is just a theory without the physical evidence. And so that kind of leads me to this. I know this has gone a little long, but physical evidence, that's really, that's what it all comes down to. And so you kind of see here, this is kind of more just for fun. This is what's known as the Water Valley Schoolhouse. It was sat in Water Valley, and there were some teachers there. There's Mary Ream Buck, was a teacher. Andy McCracken was there. You can see him in that picture, I believe, yep, in the front. And there's Doug McCracken and Clara Pickett-Garricky and Lois McCracken, we believe. And then we think Nancy McCracken was the photographer. So that's kind of just a neat picture about the Water Valley Schoolhouse, because it sat, and it was really the last building, to mark the Water Valley town site, was that schoolhouse. Well, in the 1980s, it was moved to Sheridan Lake and was part of a roadside history park. Well, many years later, it was then moved from, that's its original spot, and at original location, it's about 7 miles northwest of Brandon, and then it was moved, and then also, it's kind of hard to see on the picture. You might be able to see it better back there. There's an iron fence that was around that courthouse at Eads. And you can see that iron fence, and that iron fence is now around the Water Valley Schoolhouse today. And so that's kind of what it looks like today.
Okay, anyway, I've been going with Chuck. We've been going out to Sand Creek for 20 plus years. Every time we go metal detect, we always start at a given point. We put a flag down, we go down so far, we put another flag, we scoot over, and anyway, we try to make it in a row so we don't overlap all the time. A couple things I found that I thought is very interesting. By the way, we found hundreds of bullets, primers, just all sorts of stuff. And it's always very intriguing to me, what's the story behind that. The first one I'll share with you, we were metal detecting, and we had found really nothing that day. And we meet, and there's a little cow trail, and the cow trail is about like that, and it wanders off into nowhere. And Chuck put his metal detector down, and wham, it goes off. I dig it up, and I find this little metal star, and I got it right here. This is it right here. And Chuck said, "Oh, Star Tobacco." And I said, "What?" In today's world, if you chew, you have a little thing on the back of your jeans, and it's a little circle. It's Red Man, or I don't chew, but I don't know, but I do know the circle. I do remember that. In this time period, it was a cube of tobacco, and it was wrapped up, and the star was on it, and the name of the tobacco was Star Tobacco. And this little star would probably fit on a nickel a quarter. And I just thought that was so interesting. Chuck would come up with that. Actually, the very first thing I ever found, and this thing was deep. It was like a foot deep. It had rained the day before, I think. We came in there, and when it rains, it seems like the metal detector will go a little bit deeper. And mine went off, and I dug and dug and dug, and I found this spur. And oh, my mind just started racing. How did that guy lose this thing? Was he chasing someone? Was he being chased? I'll never know, but my mind sure goes crazy thinking, and all the stuff we find was on the site that we claim, and I don't know how you can argue against it, because we find bullets, we just find so many things. And Chuck always takes a picture of it, he GPSs it, and it's always in just one little pattern. And but this is the spur. You can look at that too. Another thing, one day we were driving May Valley Road. We're going out there. I'm almost done here. And I see this thing on Chuck's dash. I pick it up. Oh my gosh, this thing is heavy. What on earth is this thing? He proceeded to tell me it was the outside, or it was a cannonball, a piece of the cannonball. And I thought, oh my gosh, if that thing had hit you. He proceeded to tell me that there's a fuse on it. They set the fuse, they put it in the cannon, they shoot it out, and it could go off at 10 feet in the air, 5 feet, it could roll on the ground and then blow up. He proceeded to tell me, I think between 27 and 32, what I'd call them little steelies, guys used to play marbles, hunks of metal in here. And this thing, it just explodes. And I can't imagine getting hit by something like this. So we stop. Chuck says, see that green post over there? Yeah, I see it. That's where he found this thing. He marked it with a green post. So here we go. We're metal detecting. And my little machine goes off. I dig down. For once in my life, I know what I dug up. Chuck always knows. For once, I know. It was something just like this. And it was around 8 inches deep. And I thought, oh man, I really thought I had done something. And we finished that day. We ate a little lunch, got a drink. We're driving home. This is still on the dash. I said, Chuck, give me that piece I found. And this is my piece. And I was fooling around with it. And from where the post was to where I found mine was basically 100 yards. I fool around with it, and lo and behold, this sucker fits together. This is part of it. And I found mine 100 yards away from this. And I thought, what's the story? And how lucky we were to actually find that these two things fit. The book, I may be a little biased, not much, but the book is an interesting read. It is very interesting. Check out chapter 10. I probably shouldn't say that. That's my chapter. It's just about stuff I find.
Thank you, Joe. I'm got one last thing. I'm just going to read a quick excerpt from the book, and then I encourage you to stay. Get a book. If you have a question, come visit with us. Get a book, get it signed, look at some artifacts, and just a quick excerpt from our book. And this is on page 86 of our book. Butch Kelly visited a month later to look at bullets and other artifacts I found. Butch is a local historian and an Indian Wars cavalry reenactor. He portrayed a soldier in Son of the Morning Star, a TV miniseries about George Custer and events prior to the Little Bighorn. He looked at a cavalry carbine swivel from a carbine belt, some spurs, a bit, and 3 or 4 things that could be identified as military, he said. Is there anything else? Butch said after looking at hundreds of artifacts. Wasn't this enough? What more could he want? I had some 5-gallon buckets full of things like barbed wire, fence staples, round nails, and even a hubcap from a Model T Ford. Well, there was the piece of cast iron on the dash of my pickup. It didn't seem worth mentioning. I thought about putting it in my bucket of junk, but I didn't know for sure what it was, so there it stayed. And it sometimes bounced awkwardly, hitting the windshield. I went to get it. There were some threads in it that could have had something like a pipe screwed in it. I handed it to him, thinking it was worthless. Do you know what this is? I had to admit that I didn't. I thought it could be a broken piece of a windmill weight. The old windmills had counterbalance weights instead of tails that are common on them today. Some of the early weights were ornamental and looked like barnyard animals, like horses, pigs, or cows. Some were just simple round balls. Perhaps the 3 were where it screwed into the windmill. I'll tell you what this is. He straightened his shoulders. He looked directly into my eyes. I was not prepared for what he would say next. All right, I thank you guys for coming. If you want to read the rest of that, it's in the book. So you get the full account there is in the book, and you can see what he identified. And it's one of the most important artifacts ever found. And we encourage you to stop and get a book, get it signed. And thank you guys for coming today.